Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening I'm joined by Brendan St. John. He's running for office as a congressional candidate in the 15th District, and he's running as an independent. And Brendan, I'm glad to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So, my experience has been that it takes normally a crazy person to run for congressional office. I've done it myself. And you've taken and upped crazy a notch and done it as an independent, which I've also done myself in the same exact district as I've done it. Tell us about your background and why you would elevate yourself out to this level and lay it all on the line publicly the way you have.
Sure. Well, let me start off by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm married to my wife, Jessica, a woman who I truly don't deserve. We have 3 wonderful children, and we've been living up in Pleasanton for over 20 years. My career's been spent in mostly medical device marketing, where I've worked to bring products to the market that are going to benefit people's lives, right? And it was 2016 during the presidential election, where I really started to feel disgruntled with politics in general. I've always followed politics, always felt like I was somebody who kept up on the issues, but became more and more disfranchised with seeing that Congress just wasn't working for the average person.
Right.
And seeing the vitriol of the presidential campaign, it was then I first decided I just need to step back. And that's when I left the Republican Party. I'd been a lifelong Republican and said I just kind of need to detach myself from that party affiliation just for that purpose and say, hey, I don't want to be defined by any particular political party. And then as we saw and progressed through the presidential campaign and the election of President Trump, and seeing with his election, again, the vitriol that just kind of continued on, I felt like maybe change is only going to happen through a non-politician and somebody who's not connected to either political party. I see those two things as some of the biggest contributors to the challenges in Washington.
And I understand completely. Again, I think a lot of people intellectually are supportive of those ideas, whether it's they're feeling disenfranchised by the Republican Party or even the Democrat Party. In both cases, I think there are a lot of people who feel like their party has left them behind, abandoned them, doesn't care what they think anyway.
Sure.
They do care about asking for donations and contributions, but past that, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of, they're there as far as getting their voices heard through their electeds.
I've been very encouraged throughout this campaign as I've gone through all the various cities and spoken with people, like you said, who are both Democrat and Republican. And I'm amazed at how much overlap there really is in some of the beliefs that they have. They just want Washington to work, right? The label itself is very much unimportant to them. I say most people will never put in their obituary lifelong loyal Republican or lifelong loyal Democrat. Right? They want Washington to work. And so speaking with them and them finding out that I'm not a politician, that I'm just like them, a guy who's been working hard, trying to raise his family and provide a better life, they agree. It's like, that's what we need. They're a little bit tired of that establishment politics in Washington.
But it's not easy to run as an independent.
It is not easy.
You don't have parties backing you. There are oftentimes people, as intellectually as they'd like to support an independent candidate, they're tied to the party. They may be giving money to the party or party candidate specifically. What have you been seeing out there as running as an independent?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the only wasted vote is a vote not cast, because a lot of times when I first start off, they think voting for independent is just a wasted vote. I should be putting it on one or the other candidates because they see them as sort of the established candidates. And there's a lot of myths around independent candidates in general that I've been out trying to overcome those myths, to say, no, it's not that we're kind of this fringe group. We actually have a lot of beliefs that overlap with both the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, but because we don't align perfectly into one party, we run as independents. Right? So I'm getting a lot of receptivity to that, but there are a lot of hurdles, right? Raising money, as you said, is one of them. There are no big independent donors out there. There's not an independent party just looking to dole out money to non-party candidates out there. So a lot of it's been financed on my own personal money into the race, friends and family. And fortunately, as I've gotten more awareness, there have been some donors who've come in who want to finance a non-party candidate.
Right. And people also have no idea how expensive it is to run. It's not just about getting your name out there just by being out in the public. You're almost invisible. and coming in as an independent, and somebody from a business background versus a political background. When I did it, there were barriers for a number of signatures you needed to collect. 40 for candidates that were with established party, 9,260 for people like me running as an independent. The voter laws have changed, so that makes it easier for you to get your name on the ballot, but to get anything around your name, like ballot statements or other things, can get very expensive, signage, et cetera. Talk to us about the costs of things like ballot statements.
Sure. Well, there's some really good news. Let me address one of the things is I don't feel like as an independent candidate I'm invisible. One of the great things about social media is it is a free platform for candidates like myself to create a Facebook page, to create a Twitter account, and to get my message out. And there are effective strategies at which you can do that very cost effectively. But one area that there is challenges is, as you mentioned, ballot statements. There's a 250-word ballot statement that appears in the voter guides that are mailed out to every voter in the district. And so often when they open that up and they see one candidate's name with a description, you know, a glowing description because the candidate writes it.
Or a professional writes it.
Or a professional writes it. And the other candidates aren't in there, there's some assumptions that are drawn. And I've talked to people, and when the guides were delivered, people reached out to me. A lot of people reached out to me saying, why didn't you do this? And it seems like something really simple to do. And they started questioning my validity as a candidate. And it wasn't until I explained to them that that's a $10,000 cost for a single language to be printed in a primary voter's guide. So as an independent candidate, grassroots funded too, because I'm not taking any money from PACs or special interests, that's a lot of money to spend on just one impression in a voter's guide.
Yeah, and I mean, the argument is many voters are not educated about the candidates. That's their only exposure. And people say, well, if you don't do that, you're almost not going to show up. But it's gotten increasingly expensive. If you wanted to put it in 7 languages, that could be $70,000.
Exactly.
And if you're not taking big money, and then you're just kind of stuck.
Well, and again, it comes back to the people. Right? So based upon all the feedback that I was hearing, because upon learning that it cost $10,000, people were upset by that. There was always just sort of this natural assumption that the candidate was somehow dropping the ball. Right? So when people learn about that and how much it costs, they became very frustrated and felt like, well, one, this is not informing the voters. The voters sort of have a right to be informed about the candidates and what their beliefs are, and they'd like to make an informed decision at the polls. And 2, it also impacts lower income candidates who might want to be part of the political process. You know, I'm fortunate that I've done well in my career and have some funds to help self-finance, but other folks who could just be as qualified as me and viable as me might not be able to do it because they have a little bit of a lower economic status. And so based upon that, I did a video. I encouraged people to contact Catherine Baker and Steve Glazer, because I think the California legislature is really where that needs to be addressed. So I'm trying to be proactive when I see these solutions and directing the voters to how they can bring about change as well.
As far as the issues that you're most frustrated with, or you feel like could be addressed by a candidate that's not beholden in the way that other candidates might be, what are you seeing as the issues you really want to pursue if you were able to get through the primaries and into the generals and even into the Capitol building?
Well, one of the big issues that I want to focus on is the national debt. We are $21 trillion in debt, and it continues to grow. And this is an issue that seems to be bipartisan, depending upon which party is in the White House or in power, right? So as the parties flip-flop, it seems like the vocal opposition to going deeper in debt just switches to the party that's out of power, right? So in being a non-party candidate, being able to go in there and really start taking a look at what we're spending in government, we need to get to a base level of what does it really cost to run our country. And then certainly there are going to be things that we want to invest in because we just feel like it's a good investment in our country to spend these monies. And there have been promises that have made as well that we can't ignore either. But I have a sense that there's a large amount of waste, fraud, and abuse that goes on in our country, and we need to get a handle on that. We're currently borrowing $1 million a minute, and we're spending $250 billion each year just towards servicing our debt. And as we all see interest rates about to rise on the horizon, as those interest rates rise, that portion of servicing the debt's only going to get more burdensome for us. And that's going to start taking up a greater part of our annual revenues, and that's going to start hitting into vital services that people count on and depend on, because servicing the debt has to be paid first, or else it's going to hurt our credit rating as a country.
Right. And so, okay, so looking at the places where streamlining could occur
Sure.
and getting the budgets into alignment.
To your question is, as a non-party candidate, I just feel like the parties each have their own sort of, they have their funders. They have the people who have an interest. We see people who take PAC money, right? And we see how they vote. Mm-hmm. We've seen, are you familiar with the National Journal?
Okay.
So the National Journal is a nonpartisan government trend and tracking research organization. And every year they assign every member of Congress an ideology rating, which based upon their voting record, are they liberal or are they conservative? Back in 1982, there was almost 80% overlap in ideology rankings between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat. By 2013, that had shrunk to less than 1% in about 4 members of Congress, right? So they all have the folks and the interests that they're beholden to, and if you're going to be able to reduce the national debt, you have to not be beholden to those special interests that are going to demand the money, right? You have typically the conservatives, we all support our military, but I do believe there's areas where we can start cutting back on military spending. Right. I feel like we don't need to be the world's police officer. I think it's time that Japan be allowed to have their own military again. So there are things that we're spending money on that we could reduce if we were willing to make some changes.
Okay.
Being in the healthcare space for most of my career, I've seen lots of areas where there's been waste and fraud in that area too, where you can cut back those types of things without having to cut into Medicare benefits and things that people are actually counting on.
Right.
So let's identify those, let's go after those, but often those become sacred cows for different party types. Right? So there's very few voices. The last time the omnibus bill was being discussed, I think Rand Paul was the only one who kind of got up and said, why do we keep doing this? Right? You got to have more than one voice out of 435 who are saying, yeah, there's things that need to be changed, and we're going to do the best that we can to make sure that people's lives aren't devastated or impacted by this. But if we don't get a handle on this and get control of our spending, some worse things could potentially happen.
Right. One of the things that we've talked a little bit about before the show is you're talking about international scenarios. What about things like immigration into our country and the effects that has on finances and things? You have some interest in seeing how we might address that hot button issue as well, right?
Well, again, there comes back to the point of collaboration, right? Immigration, I'll talk about that a little bit. I'm a firm believer in both the carrot and the stick, right? We are a nation of laws, and people need to come here legally for a lot of different reasons. One, because when you get here legally, we want to embrace you. We want to melt you in. We're the melting pot. We want you to be able to take full advantage of all the things that America has to offer you, right? So down in Mexico, I don't know if you've been down there. I've been down there for a couple mission trips with our church, and we build homes down there. And I look at the abject poverty in the areas that we're serving. And I think to myself, if I were living in that, I think I'd probably be trying to find ways to go north as well. So sort of the carrot and the stick method that I've been thinking about is we need to increase our humanitarian aid to Mexico. Out of all the countries that we give humanitarian aid, Mexico falls a little bit further down the list than I would think for a country that's our bordered neighbor, right? So let's start investing, greatly in humanitarian aid so they can do some economic development and revitalization in some of their poor communities, so that those folks have some opportunities in their lives, right? At the same time, Mexico needs to work with us in helping to prevent some of the border crossings that are going on. President Obama's administration did a survey or research back in 2015 looking at 2013 data. And they found out of the known crossings, where the known amount of times that the person had crossed the border before, the largest number was 72 prior crossings, right? So if somebody can get into our country 72 prior times, clearly there's things going on both sides of the border that aren't really cooperating to fully prevent that from happening. So when somebody comes into our country illegally, we need to hand that person back over to Mexico and say, hey, we're going to biometrically track them and say, they're yours now, and we want to make sure that they're not crossing back into our country. If we catch them back into our country, we will have some reduction on that humanitarian aid, right? So now they have a financial benefit. They're going to get more money, But if they're not cooperative in this process, then they could eventually lose those funds through not cooperating with the United States. So there's things like that. Now, more domestically, we all know that there's a plan on the table for DACA. Right, it originally started that there were 800,000 members who signed up for DACA under President Obama's plan, right? And that was expired by President Trump, and then he gave Congress a deadline of March 5th in order to come up with a legislative solution. And there's been multiple deals offered, but recently it was up to 1.8 million, and that's in exchange for things like a border wall, through ending chain migration and other things around immigration. They're going to eventually stop us from being in the same situation 20 years down the road, right? So it rewards these folks who are here through really no fault of their own. I've talked to people throughout the district who often will challenge that. Well, if they came here illegally, why should they get anything? And I say, well, when I was a kid, if my parents moved from one state to the next, I moved with them. It really wasn't my position as a child to challenge that. And I look at these DACA recipients in that same light. I think they were doing what every child would do and going with their parents to wherever their parents were going. So I feel like that's a compassionate approach to this deal. Find a pathway under the DACA program for these 1.8 million recipients. But at the same time, let's not find ourselves in the same situation 20 years down the road. Let's fix these things. Let's get a border in place. Let's get funding for more high-tech observation. Let's get more bodies down on the border and do these types of things in ending chain migration so that we're not trying to figure out what we're going to do with 1.8 million more DACA folks later. Now, for the approximately 12 million folks, I think we have to look at that a little bit differently. And that's going to be a much more comprehensive program, and I'd have to look at the various legislation that would be presented at that time to see what I would support.
Okay. What other kinds of things are going through your mind right now as far as things that you look at as low-hanging fruit that someone could go in and build rallying points around within members on both sides of the aisles? Are there any places where you see overlap where maybe some consensus could be driven?
Well, you know, it's consensus, but it depends again on how much they really want to serve the interests of the people. Term limits is an area where there's very bipartisan support amongst the voters.
Right.
You know, north of 80% of Republicans and Democrats want term limits for Congress.
Right.
Right? Congressional folks don't want that. But there is
no job security?
No job security. They're not going to write legislation that's going to put them out of a job. Now, there is a small, growing term limits caucus, and actually Ro Khanna in the 17th Congressional District is a part of that, right? But I think it's going to take more members who have a government reform attitude going into Washington in order to bring those things to the table and provide greater voice. Right, and it's when you say it's bipartisan, I think at the end of the day, if the voters will put pressure on the folks that they support, if they have the D and the R and they're going to do that, they got to speak up and say, look, this is a campaign issue to me, and if you don't support this, then you're out. The more that voters make it an issue and more things become toxic to their career in general, then they'll support it.
Yeah, we've actually had Ro in that seat on the show before, so we've had a chance to interact. Out of curiosity, a lot of times people talk about term limits. For you, what is the right term limit? Are you making any commitments that if you were elected?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I will leave Congress after 5 consecutive terms if elected. I believe in sort of the 8, 10, 12. A president can be elected for 2 4-year terms or 8. I think a congressional member should be able to be elected for 5 terms or 10 years, and then senators for 2 6-year terms, right? So I've said, I'm not going to be one of those people that says, I believe in term limits, and by golly, I'll stay here until I die, until we get them.
I just need 40 terms to get this passed.
It seems a little disingenuous. So yeah, I am committed to serving at most, if elected, if the people of District 15 want to honor me by allowing me to serve them, after 5 terms, I would voluntarily step down and bring in new leadership. So that's a pledge I'm making right now and would encourage other candidates to make it.
Okay. And any other reforms that you would see for the House itself?
Sure. You know, again, I think legislation, there needs to be some sort of legislative reform. We get these big volumes, and both sides like to make a big show of it. They have these stacks of paper this high, but at the same time, because both sides do it, it leads you to thinking, and I call it the Campbell soup label, right? We have these labels that on all our food now, we can pick it up and it tells us everything, calories, how much protein, how many carbs, all that kind of stuff. I really feel like most people have no clue what's in legislation that gets passed out of Washington. And we need to have something that requires Congress and Washington to condense these things into 2-page, 3-page summaries that people can read and kind of form an opinion on whether they support it, disagree with it, or else how do you vocalize your concerns or support to your representative if you have no idea how it's going to affect you, right? They're so convoluted, and often they're multiple topic legislation. So it's just not one issue. There's all these different issues that for their expediency, they bundle it in there. And that's why you get often the people when they're campaigning is, well, they supported this. Well, they supported that because it was also bundled in with a piece of legislation that had numerous other aspects of it.
And that's a problem when it can be conflicting legislation, or it gives people political cover to say that they rejected it because it had this other item in it that may not have been the fully understood item that should have been covered in the legislation, or it could have been something that had nothing to do with the main line subject of the thing in the first place. Well, people just don't know what's in it.
We recently, again, increased our debt because it had provisions for all the disaster relief. So am I glad that we're going to get relief for the wildfires that we had? Absolutely. Am I glad that Houston and Miami and Puerto Rico are going to be rebuilt? Absolutely. But at some point in time, again, that gives them the cover. Well, I didn't want to be the guy who voted or gal who voted against all this, recovery relief.
Right.
I can't do that.
I don't want to cause homelessness in Miami, really. Come on.
So I had to increase our national debt by signing on to all this because it was a part of that. So those things, I think, again, I don't know that an independent coming in and a first term is going to be able to truly tackle those types of big issues, but at least you're going to have a candidate in there that's working to progress a change of mindset in Washington.
Okay. Well, we appreciate you coming on the show this evening.
Thank you.
We're about out of time, but is there a website where people can go to find out more about what you think, ask questions, those kinds of things?
Absolutely. BrennanForCongress.com is my website. Facebook as well, Brennan for Congress, and my Twitter is @BrenSt.
Okay. Thanks for that. Good luck on the race. If you hold on for just a moment, we'll be back after a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum, now known as the Liberty Forum.
Some people think that a meeting of conservatives in Silicon Valley could fit in a small room. In fact, when the Conservative Forum was founded in 2003, we did meet in a small room, a coffee shop in San Jose. It doesn't get more grassroots than this. It may surprise you that there are thousands of people right here in Silicon Valley who share your principles of liberty, free markets, and limited government. Since our humble beginnings in that coffee shop, we've outgrown 3 meeting halls. From San Jose to Gilroy to Mill Valley, we bring hundreds of people together each month from all over the Bay Area to promote the principles of American liberty. How do we do it? It starts with a stellar lineup of speakers. Speakers like Steve Forbes, Senator Jim DeMint, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, Andrew Breitbart, Pamela Geller, and many others. These speakers passionately articulate our shared principles and remind us why conservatism isn't just the smart choice, it's also the moral choice. Our monthly meetings are only one dimension of the forum. We underwrite The Right Side, a monthly television show on cable access channel KMVT. We also host a monthly Constitution discussion group and provide tables at our meetings for more than a dozen local groups who share our love of liberty to promote their specific cause. The Conservative Forum is the premier place in Silicon Valley for conservatives to gather, become invigorated, motivated, and empowered. We welcome guests to our monthly meetings and offer special discounted pricing to first-time visitors. Take a look at our speaker lineup in the coming months and join us to learn why we say liberty is made in America.
And that was a word from our underwriters, the Liberty Forum, formerly known as the Conservative Forum. They are best known for their speaker series, which occurs the second Tuesday of each month at 432 Stearland Road, Mountain View, about 3 minutes from the studio here. In June, preeminent guerrilla journalist James O'Keefe will be the speaker. In July, Mona Charen, syndicated columnist, political analyst, best-selling author, former White House speechwriter, will be on board. And in August, Brad Dacus, president of the Pacific Justice Institute, Then in September, Larry Elder, syndicated radio commentator, will be there on stage. You can find out more about the Liberty Forum at theconservativeforum.com. That'll still get you where you need to go. And you can find out things about what time the events start, etc. But we just appreciate them tremendously for making our show possible for the last 7 seasons. In closing tonight, I think it's important that voters be educated about who it is they're voting for, what those people stand for, and really start to dig deeper into what's important to them as a voter. Take the D off, take the R off, take the NPP, or formerly I, off, and just look at the people as people. And what you'll find is that there is no perfect candidate. First of all, I've said that in the past. I'm not perfect. I don't agree with myself all the time. I still voted for myself when I ran. But there's not going to be a 100% candidate for you. The only way to figure out who's going to be closest to your needs and to your preferences is to go ahead and research them in detail. Don't let a ballot statement be your only deciding factor. Do dig and find out who will really be representing you in Washington. And you might want to find out who's really representing you there now. On that note, I'd just like to thank you for joining us this evening. This has been The Right Side. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and I'll look forward to seeing you again in person or on the show sometime soon. But if you just can't wait, reach out to us at therightsidetv@gmail.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks again, and have a great evening.